Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with chicken empanadas. That's right, I'm going to show you how to make what is one of the world's greatest meat-filled pastries. Or at least it can be if you avoid the three most common mistakes. And that would be empanadas that are under-seasoned, under-filled, and undercooked. But if you use the following technique, I think you're going to avoid all those issues, no matter what kind of filling you use. Although I have to say this chicken filling really was amazing. Speaking of which, that's going to be the first thing we put together. And now we'll start by adding some olive oil to this saucepan. And then what we'll do is toss in and layer some onions, some peppers, and I'm using poblano, as well as a generous amount of garlic. And while we would normally start this by sauteing the onions and then the peppers and garlic, using this method we're going to press them down with the other ingredients. And as you'll see, we're going to perform a stirless saute, which you're going to see in a second. For now, let's go ahead and season this up with some kosher salt and freshly ground black pepper, as well as a healthy dose of chipotle, some ground cumin, and then a little bit of dried Mexican oregano, if you can find it. Otherwise, regular oregano will work beautifully. And then I'm also going to add more than a few shakes of cayenne. And then on top of that, we will add 3 packed cups of cooked chicken meat. Right, I just got this off a roasted chicken. And then once our chicken's been added and pressed down, I'm going to add one of the secret ingredients, some currants, which are basically little tiny fancy raisins. And if you can't find those, just chop up some raisins. And that's going to add some beautiful earthy sweetness to balance out all those other flavors. And then what we're going to do is head to the stove and place this over high heat, at which point we'll do absolutely nothing. All right, we're going to let those onions saute themselves. And what's happening here is the weight of those other ingredients is pressing those onions down into the oil, which is going to heat up and start sizzling those onions. And as that happens, it's going to sound something like this. Oh yeah, those onions are what we call in the business singing. And once they are singing, we will let them sing for about 3 minutes, which is basically going to take off that raw edge and just sweeten them up a little bit. And then what we'll do after about 3 minutes of sauteing those onions without touching them is go ahead and add our tomato product, which this time for me is a couple cans of those diced tomatoes that come with the green chilies. Oh yeah, you know the one. And we'll go ahead and stir those in. And this was a little bit of an experiment for me, since I usually use sauce, but because some empanada fillings can dry out, I thought these nice little moist chunks of tomato would work perfectly. And they really did, as you will see. And then once I had those stirred in, I went ahead and added a splash of water, which was probably a little too much. And I'm going to call for less in the ingredient amounts, but I do think we want to add a little bit. Since what we'll do next once this is simmering is lower our heat down to medium, and we will cook this stirring occasionally for about a half hour, or until those liquids cook down and almost disappear. And hopefully by that time our vegetables have softened and sweetened, and all these amazing flavors have melded together. And if everything goes according to plan, about a half hour to 40 minutes later, our mixture should look like this. And because we started with cut up cooked chicken, as you can see that meat's really broken down. And in this form, it's going to be really good at absorbing and holding on to that moisture. And that's it. Other than tasting this for seasoning, all we need to do is let this cool down to room temp, and then refrigerate this thoroughly before we try to fill our empanadas. All right, do not under any circumstances try to use this filling warm. And that's it. Once our chicken filling is chilling, we can move on to this very easy pastry dough, which starts with some all-purpose flour, to which we will add a little bit of salt and sugar, which I threw in at the same time to confuse you. And then what we'll do is give that a stir with our hand, which is not only to mix it, but it's also so that we have our hand coated with flour, which is kind of a big deal for the next step, which is grating in a stick and a half of very cold butter. And by using some nice floury fingers, we're going to be able to grip that butter a lot better. Which reminds me, every 10 or 20 seconds, stop and give everything a stir with your hand to not only coat those pieces of butter in the flour, but to re-flour your fingers. Oh, and when you get down to the end, don't try to be a hero. It's fine to take that last little piece and just sort of rub it and crush it into the flour with your fingertips. Which, by the way, because I was rushing through these shots, I didn't do properly. And as you will see, that little piece of butter makes an appearance later in the video. So stay tuned for that. But anyway, once we've done a great job getting the butter into the flour, we'll go ahead and drizzle in 1 large beaten egg, along with some very cold fresh water. And we will give this a mix until it starts to come together into a shaggy dough. And once it looks a little something like this, we will lose the fork and we will get in there with our hand, and we will squeeze this into a very rough lump of dough. And by the way, if you're still looking for a name for your band, lump of dough is not bad. But anyway, we'll go ahead and squeeze and press that dough together, at which point we can transfer everything from the bowl to a work surface, and then we'll use both hands to press this into a ball of dough. And when we do pie crust, which this is very similar to, we always want to make sure we don't overwork it or knead it. But here it's actually okay if we give it like 10 or 15 seconds of kneading, since I do like a little bit of elasticity in this dough. All right, just a touch. All right, we don't want to develop a ton of gluten, but I think a little bit is fine. And then what we'll do once we have our dough ball formed is go ahead and wrap that in plastic, and we will chill that in the fridge for 1 hour up to overnight. All right, just about every pastry dough is easier to work with once it's cold. So I do recommend we pop this in the fridge before we work with it. So that's exactly what I did. And about an hour later, I went ahead and pulled it out and unwrapped it. And what we'll do is place that down on a floured surface, and we'll dust a little bit of flour over the top. And then we'll take our bench scraper, and we'll divide this into 8 equal pieces, which you can just do by eye, which sometimes always works. Oh, and do you remember that little last piece of butter that I mentioned I didn't break up small enough when I put it in the flour? There it is. I mean, what are the odds? But anyway, not really a big problem, and that will be integrated as we roll our dough, which is what we're doing next. All right, so we'll take a 1/8 portion and roll it into a ball, and then we'll go ahead and press that into a disc, and then using just enough flour so it won't stick, we'll take a rolling pin, and we'll roll this out into a circle about 8 inches across. And I would say your average empanada is a little smaller than this, but I think they're easier to make if they're this size. Plus, when we eat them, we get to eat a little more. So this size works on several levels. And then once we have that rolled out exactly how we want, we are going to top this with what looks like a ridiculous amount of filling. And if there's any excess liquid, we've drained that off. And what we'll do is shape that on the front half of our circle, leaving about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch uncovered around the edge. And even though this might look like too much filling, it's not. And I'm going to prove that by adding even more filling in the form of some grated Monterey Jack cheese. Pepper jack, to be exact. All right, not too much, just like a rounded tablespoon. And then once that's been situated, I like to paint a little bit of water with my fingertip around the edge of the dough to help everything stick. At which point we'll very carefully fold that dough over the top, stretching it a little bit, but not too much. We don't want to tear it. And then we'll use our fingertips to seal those 2 edges together. And while we do that, we'll make sure we're not trapping in any large pockets of air, which we're probably not since we're using so much filling. And then once we do have the top half sealed to the bottom, we'll go ahead and pick that up to make sure it's not sticking. And we'll make sure we have a little bit of flour underneath. And then we'll set it down, and we'll begin the crimping process. And contrary to popular belief, crimping is easy, since all we're doing is starting from one end, and we're folding that dough up and pressing it in every 1/2 inch or so. And by the way, this is easier if it's facing you. All right, I'm trying to give you the best look at what I'm doing, which is not necessarily the best angle to attack this. But the point is just go along the edge. And as long as we're folding that dough up from the bottom over the top and pressing it in, we're going to be fine. And do not, under any circumstances, worry about perfection, since once these bake, they always look awesome. And then once that's sealed, we'll transfer it onto a parchment-lined baking sheet. And yes, some people do like to seal the edge by pressing it with a fork, which will work, so do that instead if you want. I mean, you are, after all, the sister sledge of how you crimp the edge. And since we are family, I'd be happy with either way. But I do think this folding over method gives us a better texture once they're baked. But before we can do that, we have to give these a nice egg washing, which is nothing more than an egg beaten with a couple teaspoons of water. And once that's been applied to the surface, I'm going to go ahead and shake a little bit of cayenne over the top for a little bit of heat and a little bit of extra visual interest, or something like that. And that's it. These are now ready to transfer into the center of a 400-degree oven for about 35 minutes, or until our pastry is well browned and crispy. And these really didn't, but don't be surprised if you get a little bit of leakage, especially since we're using such a moist filling. But as long as you cook these enough, that won't be a problem. And then, like most baked things, we want to stay crispy. Let's go ahead and transfer these onto a cooling rack, where I like to let them sit for about 5 minutes before we serve them up, which I'm going to do next is some fresh lime. And that's it. I'm going to take a knife and cut in and go in for a bite. Oh, and I should mention, these are usually fried and not baked. which is a great way to do them, and they do come out nice and crispy. But if you use this method and cook them long enough, as you will find out, they come out beautifully crisp and flaky. And I think almost every bit as good as the ones that are deep fried, with of course way less mess and effort. And these really are amazing plain, but I do enjoy a few drops of lime juice, which I think helps amplify the flavors and cuts through the richness. But Michelle, on the other hand, thinks these are way better with nothing. So again, that's up to you. And as I mentioned in the intro, the three main mistakes people make with empanadas is an under-seasoned filling, and that was definitely not a problem here. Which brings us to the second mistake, underfilling. Right, there's nothing worse than cutting into or biting into an empanada and it's half empty. But here, as you can see, the entire inside is filled. Right, so we really do want to fill these as much as humanly possible and still be able to seal them. And then the last of the three most common mistakes, especially for this baked version, is undercooking. And of course, the time I gave you is just a guide. You're going to have to make sure you don't undercook. Right, this pastry really does need to be cooked all the way through so that there's no doughiness. There is only flaky, crispy goodness. But anyway, that's it. How I like to chicken empanada. And I'm going to go ahead and finish up with one last mini experiment, which is how would these be with a lime and cilantro crema, which is basically sour cream blended with some cilantro and lime juice, which I thought was very good and had sort of the same effect of squeezing on some lime juice, only in a creamier and more herbaceous way. But whether you serve these as is or with your own secret sauce, I really do hope you give these a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.